We do have a very exciting panel this morning for me and I hope for you. In addition to my day job, I've spent over 25 years in New York City supporting early childhood education initiatives, and I have never seen a moment in time when there was a bigger gap between the opportunity and the risk. And we're going to talk about all of that today because it applies not only to the investment opportunity, but it also applies to what's going on in the classroom and truly important issues for our children and society. So thank you all for coming. We're excited. We're going to get going. I'd like to ask each of our panelists, Mark Engel, Amanda Bickerstaff, and Monique Malcolm-Hay, to introduce themselves quickly. They can do a much better job at that than I ever could, and then we'll get rolling.
So great to be here. Thanks for coming. I'm Mark Angel. I'm the CEO and one of the founders at Amira Learning. Amira is an AI tutor that was created at Carnegie Mellon and currently works with about 4 million students in the United States and in 19 countries. Amira's job is to listen to students read out loud and understand when they're making mistakes, and that comes directly from my background. I've been working in speech recognition and AI for a long, long time.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Amanda Bickerstaff. I'm the CEO and founder of AI for Education. We're about as old as ChatGPT. We started last April. We actually started the first time I ever used ChatGPT. I asked it to write me a rubric. So if there are any educators in here, you know that rubrics are terrible and hard. And as soon as ChatGPT responded with a really nicely written rubric and format as a table, I realized two things very quickly. One is that this is the transformational technology we've talked around a lot in education the last 20 years that really was exposed it was not possible during COVID. But that secondly, this is just not an intuitive technology. This is not something that is better Google or something you could just pick up, that it was going to require some really deep thinking and intentionality around it. And so we launched AI for Education. We're now, our free resources are accessed by people over 100 countries every week. And we work with schools and districts on two kind of parts, one on AI guidance development around responsible use, and then training.
Hello, everyone. Really great to be here with you all. My name is Monique Malcolm-Hay. I'm an investor at Rethink Education. I actually started my career working at PwC, and I then went to go and work at an AI native startup called Future Fit AI, where essentially we were focused on helping people to navigate career transitions leveraging AI. I then went on to do my MBA and my MA in education at Stanford. So I was in the Bay Area for a couple of years, and now at Rethink. And so at Rethink, we are an early stage in VC firm investing in education and workforce-focused companies. And we are doing a lot around AI at the moment. Just a few months ago, we actually launched an AI series where we invite educators and business leaders and portfolio founders, as well as a few other companies too, to come together and discuss the latest development in AI. And so there's been some really interesting insights that's come out of that. And also, fun fact, Mark here is one of our portfolio founders as well at Rethink. So great to share a panel with you too.
Fantastic. Thank you all. So let me just start with a quick question for the audience. How many people here ever went to school? Excellent. How many of you have children who are going to school? And how many of you are educators in the classroom? Thank you all on that last one. I want to start with Amanda because Amanda is, of the three exceptional panelists we have here, the one with the most classroom experience. And I think that's a great place to start if we're going to talk about learning tools. So as a former educator, what have you seen in models for ed tech over the last 20 years? And what do you see now that's different?
I think it's pretty interesting. So I taught in New York City. So I was a high school biology teacher at 22 with no experience. I was a teaching fellow and walked into one of the most complex environments that I think I possibly could. And in that moment, I recognized a couple of things. Number one is that there's so much more than just the teacher in a classroom and the student that's ready to learn or not ready to learn. The complexity that students bring with them is so much bigger in some ways, especially in marginalized and at-risk communities. And so that was like my first really big learning that I had. It's also like, I mean, 20 years ago, guys, remember like a couple computers that often didn't work, or a laptop cart. I'm sorry, no one else, like you guys aren't educators, but if you had a laptop cart that wasn't charged and you put it in front of a group of 25 unruly high school students in the Bronx, get ready for nothing to happen. And so, you know, it was like the start of that. But I do remember 20 years ago that I was being told that I would be replaced by the internet. Like the internet was going to replace teachers. And that rhetoric has continued since then. And I think that that is something that we cannot like belie at all. Like this is something that has been, like we don't treat teachers in the US very kindly. And we don't treat them as professionals. And I think that's really important for us to consider at this moment in time, because we talk about technology. We put everyone in COVID in this moment where we had to take an industrial model of education and put it fully online. And what happened is we had talked about how great ed tech was. You know, we're going to be able to figure it out. And then all it happened was like kids on Zoom, like either in their pajamas, not paying attention, teachers having to let kids into their homes and their lives, and they did. And the technology just was not good enough. There was not like, I mean, we lost so much learning loss, especially with younger students. If you had a 5 to 7-year-old, you know what I'm talking about. Those kids were not learning at home. And in fact, there's research that shows how much learning loss. And in the pandemic, I was actually in Australia. So I had that experience of running a company in Australia and then also seeing that here, that the learning loss that happened was pretty significant. And that's why, you know, Amira and other tools are really important. But I think that this moment in time is that there's been a promise of ed tech that just has not been realized. And I would say that right now there are enormous opportunities for generative AI systems that, especially as they improve, to do that. But what we see right now is flooding the same thing. The AI principal, the AI teacher, like we're going to replace all the teachers. And I'll just give one final anecdote. We work with a district, and we really encourage our district partners to do research on what's actually happening. And we ask a question, what is the biggest risk you see? And students in that district said ethical concerns. They were just concerned about the ethics of AI. Teachers are most concerned about their job security. And so I think we have to recognize that this is a very tricky space and that ed tech hasn't necessarily made schools better yet. And I don't think Gen AI has yet either.
Yet. I think that's the
Happy morning, everybody.
Yet is the right word.
right. So on a personal note, I was blessed to have a cousin who wrote the paper, did the academic work to support an organization back in the late 60s called Children's Television Workshop, which, if you are young enough and don't know, turned into something called Sesame Street. And back then, people were equally worried about something invading children's minds. Yep. Right, TV back then. There was no sense that TV could be used to administer education. So we've seen this movie before. That time it turned out successfully. Mark, what are we looking at here in terms of tools and opportunities?
Yeah, it's always important to understand history and context, and nowhere more than with technology. We've had decades and decades of learning around the adoption curve and the challenges. It wasn't just television people were afraid of. In the 1890s, people were petrified about the introduction of the bicycle. And you go back and you look at the history of when the bicycle came out, and governments rushed to regulate it, and people were afraid of a syndrome called bicycle face, where riding a bicycle would warp your facial muscles. So fear is nothing new. And every time we see the dawn of something special, we also see the incredible worry and fears that come with it. It doesn't mean the fears are invalid. There's a lot of good reasons to be frightened about what AI will bring. But it is important to say that we know that, number one, anything that's transformational will be feared. And number two, anything that's transformational won't create a transformation quite as quick as we initially expect. It takes time, and this is the foundational lesson of all important technologies. The good news is that in education, as Amanda was saying, we have an opportunity to do something that tech has not done before. I spent most of my career in healthcare and med tech. Since 1970, we've added about 10 years to the average life expectancy of people thanks to innovations like biotech and CRISPR and many more. In those same 50 years, reading scores in this country have moved zero, right? Zero. It's really important to say that as much as we worry about tech, the biggest risk is not doing anything new, because what we've been doing has been a disaster, right? So what I'll tell you is just what Amanda said. If you think about the waves of tech, first generation, 20, 25 years ago, nothing more than taking content and digitizing it. Second generation, what we've got in classrooms today, just taking content and quote unquote adapting it. It's really primitive stuff. AI has the first real opportunity to make a difference, and it will.
It does have that opportunity, but Mark, you've also said that not everything is fit for purpose in the classroom.
Yeah, well,
Right.
this is the worrying part. The truth is, AI is like nothing. AI today is like nothing I have ever seen before in terms of the power and rapidity of advancement. And what is very worrying is that we're taking applications that were created by giant technology companies to generate better ad delivery engines, and we're using them in the classroom with absolutely no vetting, no change, no parameters around the use, and this is concerning. It's a reflection of how amazing these things are, that they can be used in that way, but there's rightly a lot of difficult things that are going to happen around teachers pouring student data and student information into the large-scale public models. So, yep.
So with that risk that we're going to explore in a minute in mind, what does good learning in the classroom look like?
Well, here's the big lesson of AI. It's important to understand that AI has already transformed many verticals. If you go into a manufacturing plant, if you go into a trading floor in Wall Street, you will see a model of how AI works. And that model is well understood. All AI folks understand it's about what the manufacturing people call co-botting. And what that means is that you design AI to work in partnership and combination with the human being, where you create a harmony that leverages the inherent strengths of people and the inherent strengths of large language models and conversational models. And those two things have very real and permanent strengths and weaknesses, and we need to design for what we call in Amira the three-part harmony of a student, a teacher, and an AI assistant working together to create a learning dialogue. And that's our belief about what a classroom will look like. It'll look like that three-part harmony with each person in that learning cycle doing what they do best.
Amanda, do you see applications out there that fit that rubric?
Okay, I'm going to push back a little bit. Love you, Mark.
We're here.
But I think that the idea that a classroom will have those three parts, I think actually what probably will happen is, especially in older grades, is that there will be places where there'll be no technology. I think that leaning into like social emotional learning and durable skills will be much more important in middle and high school. I think that elementary is really set to change quite a bit with the technologies like Amira and others around early reading and early math. But I do think that when you think about what was uniquely human up until 2 years ago, like writing an essay, presentations, imagery, like poetry. Who in here, hey, I was really bad at poetry, you know, everybody. That these are all now no longer human-only skills. And a lot of what we do and assess students are on these skills. And so the spaces that we're going to have to really think about are how are we going to continue to focus on the human component and what really truly makes us special, and engages students to realize that their learning matters. I think that when you talk about good learning, one of the biggest issues we have today is that learning doesn't feel meaningful, authentic, or real to young people. it just doesn't. You talk about reading scores not increasing. We have attendance that has decreased over the last 50 years. We have kids that are disengaged, kids that just follow through and then disappear. In New York City, there are 1 million students missing, essentially, that left during COVID, and we don't know where they are. And so I think that there's a really big need to actually create new models. And I was actually talking to someone yesterday, how could we possibly assess the efficacy of generative AI tools in the classroom when the classroom itself has to change? The models themselves are going to force new methods and new places that have never been discussed before. But what we're doing is we're taking this brand new, non-intuitive, transformational technology, and we're lifting and shifting into a system that has not changed at all, really, since the industrial model. Like, the reason why kids go to school right now is because they stopped being in factories and they stopped being in, fields, right? This is why the industrial model exists, and it hasn't really changed. 8 hours, everything that happens. And so, but what we're doing is we're taking this and we're just putting it in. And so the idea of the triad is really interesting, but I do think that there are going to be moments in which there are going to be spaces that are going to really push our thinking about what learning is and should be. And so I think right now there are 2 themes that are happening, though, and I know Monique is going to have a lot to talk about. The 2 big themes in generative AI education technology right now are in lesson planning and kind of teacher productivity, and in student tutors. And I think that student tutors have been the holy grail for a long time. I mean, this is something that, you talk about intelligent tutoring, 20, 30 years. But lesson planning, you have We Are Teachers, or not We Are Teachers, Teachers Pay Teachers, which is not exactly high quality instructional material that you can buy and teachers will spend 3 hours on. I think that the majority of the apps out there today that are really gaining steam are generative AI versions of Teachers Pay Teachers. And the difference is now you're kind of making it a little bit more customized and it's a whole bunch faster. And I think that that's what we see right now. And I don't see a lot of truly let's rethink education. And then how does this technology actually get us there based on the research and what works best for kids?
That's quite a sobering thought for this
Man, guys,
panel.
am I just a bummer?
Yeah.
I promise there are positive things too. We'll talk about that as well.
So speaking of positive things, Monique, you're the one who's got to eventually support these ideas. You see a lot of them. What do you see that is most promising? And I would ask you to think about most promising for students and educators, and let's be honest, most promising for you as an investor. And they're not always the same thing.
No, they're not always the same thing. I would probably start by saying what I'm seeing a lot of, or what I've seen a lot of in the past year, has actually not been promising yet. And so we've reviewed a ton of AI and education tools, and it's been quite concerning to see that so many of these tools really promote students to circumvent critical thinking and helps them just jump directly to the answer without actually inspiring learning and really sort of cutting short that process. And so that's been really disheartening, I guess, both from an outcomes perspective. At Rethink Education, we are an impact-focused fund. And so when we make investments, the financial returns as well as impact are both equally as important to us. What I would say is it's actually interesting because from a financial returns perspective, a lot of these tools are doing really well and are sort of scaling really quickly, getting a lot of early traction. But as an impact fund, it's just not that interesting to us. And so I will then go on to say that I am an AI optimist. And so what I am starting to see are new models coming through where, similar to what Mark was saying, it is pairing the teacher and leveraging what they're uniquely capable of doing with the AI. And so just recently, a study came out of Stanford University where there were a group of researchers who put together a platform called Tutor Copilot. And essentially what they did is they leveraged GPT-4, trained it on 700 sessions that were delivered by a tutor who was doing one-to-one math lessons with 1st to 5th graders. And then now what that model can do is when tutors are tutoring these 1st to 5th graders, they can press a button and the model will generate prompts for them to ask specific questions to the students to help them arrive at the right answer and help them learn during the process. And the results of that study show that not only are those students getting better test scores than they were previously, but also they're more engaged and inspired by the learning they're doing because those tutors are being really effective. And so that's really, really great to hear. And that model works particularly well with tutors who are new to tutoring, haven't quite learned what to do yet. And so they can leverage AI to make them much more effective and impactful in that model. And the other benefit as well is then to schools, because this study basically showed that to deliver this AI to these tutors, it costs $20 per tutor, which is significantly cheaper than other training methods that have been used in the past to train teachers. So I think when I hear studies like that, that gets me really excited. And so I'm on the lookout for more examples like that.
Such as, let me put you on the spot, what else have you seen?
In terms of specific companies
Yeah.
that are leveraging that.
Or any technology that you think is potentially important for the classroom and for investors.
Well, I mean, one example I would give is a company that's actually in our portfolio called Magic School AI. The great thing about Magic School is that the founder is a former educator. And so he cares deeply about providing impactful learning solutions and his ensuring that in his product suite of tools that it does include the teacher in the loop in the learning that is provided to students. And so they started off specifically helping teachers with lesson planning, but are now adding more tools to their product set that also it directly engages the student as well, while still leveraging the teacher's capabilities in the classroom too. And I guess one thing that we really look at when it comes to assessing these companies is thinking about outcomes, as I mentioned earlier. And I think when a lot of people think about outcomes, they immediately only think about test scores and think about the quantitative measures. But I think it's also really important to think about the qualitative side as well. And so how are we thinking about whether these tools inspire students and motivate them to want to learn more, or motivate them to have a growth mindset? And I think a company like Magic School, they really place that focus in everything they do.
I'll take the moderator's prerogative here and tell you that about 24 years ago, we founded an organization in New York City called the Read Alliance. And we teach teenagers a very specific curriculum that comes out of the University of Utah called the Reading for All Learners program. And we teach them to deliver that one-on-one to young learners, kindergartners, first graders, and second graders that are identified as being deficient in their learning. And I am unconvinced that anything that comes out of a computer can replace the joy that a young kid gets, and therefore the motivation that they get by looking up to someone from their neighborhood, right, who's teaching them how to learn, really.
Can I say something about that? You can't talk about AI without talking about bias. And the idea that like an AI tutor is going to be able to even like there are people already trying to create these models and these applications that have more of a cultural bent. And there's another study from Stanford that came out this last week that said they went to multiple large language models and they asked for stories about kids in classrooms. So tell me about a peer tutoring where there's a struggling student and a non-struggling student. Tell about a story of a star student going to applying to college. And what happened is that the amount of just unforced stereotypes, like literally the prompt was, tell me a story about a struggling student getting help from another student. That struggling student was almost always a minority, almost always. You talk about indigenous people, Native Americans, you talk about African Americans, non-native English speakers. The star student was almost always white, mostly male. You saw that the way that the bots themselves, multiple large language models, were just absolutely not even, like this is what OpenAI calls this ungrounded inferences, but it's like unforced errors. It's unforced stereotypes. Like, you didn't ask for a stereotype, we're just gonna give it to you, don't worry. And I think that this is something when you talk about, like, when we think about what AI could potentially do, is that these systems are built off of human data up until the last year. With new models, we're able to create synthetic data sets, but they're being created by people that do not look like the diversity of this room, let's be honest. And I think that this is where, when you talk about the joy and the special and the things that we're doing, like, we have to be really, really thoughtful about how this is potentially going to impact our kids that look differently, that talk differently. There's also research that shows that if you're using OpenAI, if you're using ChatGPT, and you use a female-sounding name, you will get less technical answers back. If you are going to be, even the language in which you prompt gives different responses, and some of them are less rigorous, some of them are less creative, some of them are more polite. And I think that this is something that we have to recognize a lot, because the young people that we have, if a person is mean to you, okay, but what happens if a bot is mean to you, or biased, or and even like gives you something back? Like, how do we prepare students for that and then connect them to their communities in meaningful ways? I think that's going to be a huge question that goes back to your idea of connecting them to people that look like themselves, like their tutors. Like, that's going to be an enormous opportunity for us to think about, but also that potential risk.
So, go ahead, Monique.
Yeah, I was also just going to add to that and say, so earlier you mentioned the different groups of sort of AI companies that we're seeing today, which was absolutely right. So one of those is student tutors, and then the others are tools that help teachers and help them cut down the administrative burden. But there is this kind of third group of AI tools that are popping up, which is basically helping to inform schools on how to make decisions around how students are managed, or other types of decisions. And I think that's where, the bias is really scary. Because then if schools are leveraging these AI models to help inform them on, okay, who do we provide additional assistance to, and other things of that nature, it can get really concerning if the AI is producing incorrect answers or putting people into categories that they shouldn't be in. I think this just then ties into hallucinations as well, which is also a huge issue with AI companies at the moment. And actually just recently in Nevada, a school was using an AI model to help it identify which students were at risk. And previously they had identified that 200,000 students were at risk. But this model said that only 65 students were at risk, which is a significant difference. And so that is a huge concern if schools are leveraging these models to make decisions at the moment.
So this gets back to understanding how technology evolves and the fact that it takes time to be good. Yeah. We work with a great scientist, and she studies bias. And when she puts 6-year-olds who've never seen, never touched, never heard of or understood AI into a process where she'll ask them things like, draw me a picture of a doctor. Guess what? They almost always draw a white man. Draw me a picture of a student who is misbehaving. Guess what? They'll typically draw a picture of a person with color. The AI models are biased because they reach out into the world and extract information from our day-to-day societal impasse. And guess what? It's biased, right? And so what we need to understand is the problem isn't AI. Problem is there's bias. And it's in people, it's in our processes, and yes, it's in AI. I'll actually tell you, maybe optimistically, but it will turn out to be a lot easier to pound the bias out of large language models than it is to pound the bias out of people, right? So we should just be careful, because the problem is real, but I will say that this is exactly the kind of thought process that deceives us into persisting with solutions that are entirely based on human capital that we know just don't work. So we just need to accept a little bit of the bad with the good, or we're going to continue to do what education has been marvelously successful at, which is to resist innovation and fail our kids. Right.
But I just want to say something though, is that we've known that there have been AI has bias for a long time, and people have not been listened to.
Yeah.
I just want to say, yes, the reason why OpenAI gives ungrounded inferences like this is because stock photos and the majority of the internet is not just in English but American English. Wikipedia has been edited by one dude. 70% of Wikipedia is one guy that is edited. So talk about this levels of bias.
Exactly right.
But the thing is though, we've known from people that have at Google and MIT that have said AI bias systems around facial recognition and who a self-driving car would hit, these types of crazy things. And we have not looked at that. And I think that this is the opportunity where, because it is happening with these unforced errors, where if you put literally OpenAI in their computer vision model, they have if you ever want to read about the harms of these AI models, read the system card. If you're a nerd like me, you read all of them, but they had to, put in, let's see what happens when we put this computer vision, we'll put an image of a woman and ask for advice. And every single piece of advice was about her weight. Every single piece of advice. This is the thing that we have, now I think it's big enough and bold enough that we have to see it, because this is something that's going to impact all of us in this room. It's definitely going to impact the people that use these tools and the usability of them as well. And I think that this is an opportunity, yes, but we have to pound it out. There has to be commitment for the people that are at Microsoft and OpenAI and Anthropic to do this, because that is our opportunity. But
so maybe we'll reverse roles on that one. I think it's really important to understand incentives. There's very little incentive, and we work with these folks every day. I know them. Google and Amazon are investors in Amira. They have no incentive to pound out the bias. Okay, there's nothing in their business model, nothing in their regulatory climate, nothing in the way that they work will do that. And this is where we do need to understand that AI, even though 90% of the data scientists in the world work for 4 companies, we need to understand that AI can be bigger than a handful of companies pursuing this vision of making the world's best advertising engine. So it is right. If we depend on OpenAI and Anthropic to get rid of bias, we'll probably be waiting a long time. But the folks at this conference, the policymakers, they have the ability and the power to create regulation and to create incentives where we can build large language models that are in fact designed with a high-level intent to not have bias.
I'll just take the moderator's prerogative in here and say if people really cared about eliminating bias, Mark Zuckerberg wouldn't exist.
That's right. That's right. That's
right. The problem.
Yeah, that's.
I wanted to make a distinction here as well, I guess putting my VC hat on. So, when we're looking at AI companies, there is a difference between companies that are sort of wrappers and just wrap themselves around the existing LLMs that exist out there. So, like GPT-4, Claude, etc. And so when we find those wrapper companies, that is concerning. That's when you're kind of looking at, okay, what are these big LLM players? How are they thinking about bias, and what are their processes like? But then there are another group of companies that are essentially leveraging these models and training it with their own data. And they may have diverse teams. They then are really thinking thoughtfully about what data they're inputting into the model. And so that is different and a lot more promising, in my opinion, when it comes to combating some of these issues.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah, it only takes 1,000 diverse photos in a image generator to give more diverse back to you. Only 1,000. And so I'll give you guys a challenge. Go to ChatGPT and ask for a classroom of it, in New York or Mexico or anywhere, and then go to Ideogram or Firefly, Adobe Firefly, and ask the same thing. And you're gonna see the difference between DALL-E, which is the OpenAI model, which is hysterically stereotypical. In fact, we did this live in a session in Mexico on Friday, and it was it was bordering on offensive. It was so funny. People are like, what? This is not what our classrooms look like. But if you compare that to those that are responsibly made, like Adobe Firefly and Ideogram, you'll actually see the classroom looks like a classroom. Yeah. And I think that that's where you can start to see that the differences between those that are taking the time and effort, because it's actually not that hard. It's not that hard. And so, but so much of what is being driven is the applications that are built on top of DALL-E and Stable Diffusion and others that have been shown to have enormous bias. And I think that's where a huge opportunity, talk about an opportunity, like having people that are thinking about this and then putting pressure, whether an investor, a builder, someone like me who's just very loud and like has hopefully like people trust about this, like that's our real opportunity, because we can be different, because the technology is easier to work with than any technology that's ever come before. Like you all can build with technology right now with no degree and no time. You're not going to be that great at it, I'll be honest, but you can at least try. But that's the thing that's like really interesting, and that's like a huge opportunity, that this democratizes access not just to technology, but to building and creating with technology, that I hope to see that we have in the next wave of who comes to Monique are educators and practitioners and social impact and diverse populations saying, you know what, we're not going to have that same system that Mark has been talking about. We're going to create something new because we actually understand it.
AI is sycophantic. So you could make the controversial statement that if there's bias in the world and the results of your use of AI are bias, it's actually just doing what it's supposed to do. I'm not saying I support that, but you could make that argument, and I think a lot of people do. A lot of people with a commercial intention, not a classroom intention, unfortunately. So how do we understand the difference between those folks and the folks that I think are closer to what Monique is trying to do? Right? Who are the good operators and the bad operators out there, and what should we be looking for, and signals should we be identifying?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. And so when I meet with companies, there are specific questions that I ask to understand what model they're leveraging and how it's been built and how thoughtful the founders have been as well. And so I guess tagging on to what I was saying earlier, one question is really asking, is this a wrapper around an existing LLM, or has this company actually put an application layer on top and they're training the model with their own data? So once you get to the bottom of that, the next question is then, what data are they using to train the model? And even just asking those questions alone really, really helps to understand how these founders are thinking about things, whether they are focused on reducing bias, and that can give a lot of clarity around what kind of company this is. So I would start there.
Yeah, I'll just say, and I want to hearken back to the medical analogy again. We're on the verge where most of pharma is going to be generated by AI. We're already seeing that AI is better than the best oncologists in detecting tumors in MRIs. If you've seen the studies, Google's tumor detector now is 99% accurate. But we don't ask in the medical world how people do things. We are rigorous about measuring outcomes and results, right? And we put every single intervention, a drug, a treatment, through a rigorous set of clinical trials to determine whether it actually works and what negative side effects it has. Now, guess what? In education, we have nothing like that. So we're reduced to asking questions like, oh, gee, how did somebody make this model, when we should actually be asking the question, do we have empirical evidence that this intervention, this tool, is going to do us some good? And so what I will just say is that the energy needs to be focused on that. We have been unbelievably hypocritical in creating a system where we can't put a pill in a child's mouth without massive research and backing, but we are absolutely willing to put one piece of technology, one intervention after another in front of our kids without the slightest evidence or backing that it's going to do any good. So my answer is, let's get focused in the education space on outcomes. Let's get focused on measuring effect size and being in the business of seeing what works.
Okay, I totally agree. So we actually have 5 questions to ask ed tech providers on our website. As a former ed tech builder, when all these applications started coming out, I was like, oh my gosh, I got we have to have some kind of navigation. Considering that Chicago Public Schools, we helped write their AI guidance, and they had 894 tools with generative AI in them last year. So these are completely unvetted.
And not a single one
Yeah,
has
complete-
ever had
an
an
actual
RCT
study.
done on
Yeah,
it, right?
and
Yeah,
s-
so that's right.
And
Yep.
what I'll do is I'll actually pinpoint the study that you talked about, because if you go deeper to the Stanford study on the tutor copilot, it actually had almost no effect. It was 3 to 4% better in a 2-month study. The study had no impact on actual scores on the standardized testing. So it did help the students that had poor tutors by 9%, but again, statistically not significant on the actual assessments. So while it is a nice thing to start, we are at a place where there is already a dearth of like very high quality, objective, large sample studies out there. So I think this is like, if the first thing that we talk about is like, of course, understand the models, student privacy and data. Like, did anybody hear about the All Here kerfuffle? You guys are investors. Emma, I'll go into that. So LAUSD, our builder of Cavallo, the superintendent there, went all in on AI. So they did a big RFP and on an AI assistant, and they worked with All Here, which was a decent sized startup. I don't know, you probably know more than I do. But what ended up happening is that this idea of creating this tutor for 100 different language groups and, be able to help parents and students was this huge goal that was actually not possible yet. Because when you talked about technology not being very good yet, guys, we're in the dial-up phase of generative AI. Remember dial-up and how bad it was? Like, we're in a phase where it works sometimes and not the other times, and it got some really cool things and some things that don't work, that it was just not possible. So it fell apart and it wasn't great. But the thing that was probably the most concerning is that students' data and private data was going to 7 different countries' servers. 7 different countries. And so when we talk about that unvetted, so like data privacy and security, I think is really important. But the thing is, like, we're not going to get behind. We are actually tech agnostic. We have never espoused a tool. We do train on the foundational models because we believe it's important to give people that foundational knowledge. But the thing is, like, we're not going to ever support a tool until there is a study that says this makes schools better, that this makes teaching easier and feel better, like efficacy. Like, it could just be about joy and like maybe work-life balance. That's okay for an outcome. But it should also be, if it's student facing and you're not doing student level outcome like research, then we're never going to be a fan of yours, because that has to happen. We have to change, just as you said, like the duty of care that we have as teachers, educators, leaders really high, but also the people building that technology that are getting paid for that technology need to have a duty of care as well to those students. And that should lead to like 20 years of bad ed tech and some good ed tech has moved the dial nothing. And unless we change the way that we actually look and vet tools and build tools, then we're not going to see a change that's going to be important, because there's already a moment right now where kids are being actively discouraged in college. Like, there's a study by Cengage that showed that recent college graduates, 55% of students were actively discouraged in their college from using generative AI. And 62 to 70% of hiring managers said they were looking to hire recent graduates with AI skills. We're already seeing that, right? That really, like, that's only going to get larger and larger and larger. And I think that that's where we have to, like, as impact investors in this room and people that have some of that ability to put pressure where pressure should be put on, that's a space that I think is going to be really important.
So we have a Q&A session coming up. Before we get there, I wanted to ask each of you, outside of your own organizations or companies that you invest in, for the educators in the room, where would you point them for tools? What 1 or 2 tools do you think would be helpful for them to know about?
Should I just say Amira Learning and everything from, I'm just going to say Amira Learning and everything in Rethink Portfolio. Not really, but.
Go ahead, Marty, you start.
I mean, yeah, I would start by saying Amira Learning. I definitely think it's a great tool to help with learning how to read. And then the tool that I mentioned earlier, which is Magic School AI, I think in terms of companies in the Rethink Education portfolio that are AI native, we're very bullish on Magic School and what they're doing. As I mentioned before, Adil, he's a former educator. He has been in educators' shoes before, understands what's important, and has started to show real outcomes as well. And so he actually has this thing called the Wall of Love, where it shows what students and teachers are saying about the product and how it's motivating them and inspiring them to learn more, inspiring them to have a growth mindset. And so that's where I would say to look.
Yeah, so I think Magic School's doing some really interesting things. There's a company in the math space called Chiron that's basically using AI to stitch together videos of master teachers working into an interactive tutoring process. Definitely feel like there's some things in the science space. There's a company called Labster that does some amazing things using AI and simulations to let students do hands-on experimentation in ways that would never kind of be possible or safe with real physical tools. Some amazing stuff out there already.
I think for us, we, because of the power the large language model foundation models have, and so much of Magic School and others are actually run on these models, we suggest really just finding a foundational chatbot and getting in there and using it and building capacity. So what I've been a Claude stan since last June. So we started doing AI trainings last June. And so we've actually trained everyone on ChatGPT, because you can't, people don't realize that Magic School is ChatGPT with a layer on top of it and other things. So if you don't teach them about ChatGPT, they think that it's something else because it's so eponymous. So we always start with ChatGPT and prompting, which is a great way to teach critical thinking and resilience and how to use technology. And then we Claude a lot with the artifacts feature, where you can actually build games. There's so many ed tech tools that are like Kahoot and others where you have to build games. You could do that right now in 10 seconds for your students live and get them to play it. So we like to really focus on that. I will say the biggest, who in here has used Notebook LM? Oh no, okay. There we go. He knows. First of all, who's used Claude? If you're doing writing, it's probably the best writer, and their new model that came out this last week is going to make it even better. But Notebook LM is probably the first time that people have found a UX UI that they really enjoy. So what you can do is Notebook LM is a Google tool. It's free. It's built on their 1.5 million token window. So that really, really big context window. And you can upload up to 50 sources, and you can create you could talk to your documents like a mini walled garden, but you can also build an audio overview that is a podcast, a fully AI podcast. And if you want to blow your minds and your family's minds, you should do that. But put that in front of teachers and you've lost them. They're like, this is the best thing that's ever happened. But I do think that opportunity to show people to start building that interest and that engagement is really great. And then I think they're better users of Magic Schools and Amira's and other tools because they know what's beneath it. They know the best questions to ask. And they also know if it doesn't quite work, I can now pull that off and continue to work with it in other models.
Thank you. So a few questions from this lovely audience. First one is, it's sort of the same question, two sides of the same coin. First, how can we mitigate systemic discrimination, an issue that we've talked about a bit, but maybe we could explore it. Systemic discrimination caused or exacerbated by AI products in educational institutions, and then the converse of that, how can we use AI to combat systemic discrimination?
Yeah. So the way that these models work is through a training process. The training process is key to the content and the information that we throw in. If you look at what incentives are driving them today, they compete against a set of standard benchmarks to be good at something like writing. So if we are going to get into a world where they're incented to train models to battle bias and discrimination, some of it will come from creating benchmarks and tests that put those models to the test in exactly that way. And so the starting point is for us to put the right kinds of incentives into play. In terms of how the models can battle bias, again, the models are at all of our disposal, and they are incredibly good. This is the syncopatic idea. They're incredibly good at doing what we ask them to do. And so I think all educators have the power and the ability today to try to, in great prompting and in great management of the creative process, to stamp the goals that creator has on the outputs. And yeah, you can get models to be very focused on being culturally responsive and helping students to see in the mirror what you want them to see if you're prompting in the right way. So.
Thank you. This next question had to have come from a teacher. Thank you. Impact outcomes. Other than student outcomes that can take years to see gains, and I would add can also fade, right? What are examples of data points that show, quote, this makes schools better, and specific examples, please?
I think that there are a couple. There have been studies that look at things like engagement, which it's pretty like amorphous, but things like, are kids coming to school on time more? Are they staying the whole day? Are they is there we have the company I ran in Australia looked at student perceptions of teaching, and which was a climate focused thing. And what we saw is that when students believed that they had space in the school, their teachers cared, that actually increased their engagement and their willingness to come to school. So I think that is something that we've seen be really successful when you look at culture and the whole student. We also built a well-being tool and did research on well-being for not child well-being, but student well-being, and found that when you looked at belonging and you looked at resilience and you looked at safety, that students that felt like in the higher quartile of those were not just willing to come to school and engage, but actually were the ones that had the highest grades, especially those that were improving. So I think that there are plenty of ways to look at different outcomes. I think the one that we tend to not look closely enough is efficacy. Does a student feel like they belong? Do they feel like they can succeed? Do they feel like they have at least one, there's indications that show the students that retain in school, if they have one adult in the school they feel like they can go to for help that cares about them, that's enough. One adult. It doesn't have to be a 5, but one adult. But the students that fail out, that drop out, that have issues around retaining tend to have no one like that in the school. So I think that that's something that we miss. Does a student have their own efficacy? Do they believe they can learn? Do they believe it's important? Do they believe that the people around them care that they do? And the same thing with teachers. Teacher efficacy, do they feel like they can be successful? These are places that are they are so much easier to get at in a short form, and they're easier to actually tie back to causation, because you can start to do that and what actually makes you feel most confident, most successful, and we just don't do it enough because there's not an incentive to do it. And I think that that's where something like a magic school, I would love to, Adil is a buddy as well, but I'd love to see more of that. That wall of love could be very easily transitioned into a large sample study about true teacher efficacy. Does saving 5 hours a week or 3 hours or 2 hours a week on lesson planning actually make teachers happier and feel more successful in the classroom? That would take almost no time to do, and we just have not incentivized it in a way to make that something that it's not just something you could do, but something that's expected.
This one, Monique, is for you. Have you seen good examples of startups that have invested in doing this outcome research on their tools?
One thing I would say is there's an organization called Lean Lab Foundation, and they work very closely with startups to do RCTs and provide this efficacy information. And so they're probably a good hub to go to find out which companies are actually taking the time out to do some of these studies. And so, yeah, I'd probably point people to that resource.
Yeah, the good news is this is starting to be a trend. There's another website called Evidence for ESSA. It's produced by Johns Hopkins University, and they publish research on the efficacy of startups, and there's older school versions of this that most startups don't participate in, but there's a clearinghouse and other places you can go. Yeah.
There's also a move towards, so high dosage tutoring. We talked about COVID and like the learning loss that happened. High dosage tutoring has been shown to be really powerful. And there's now a move in the US for outcomes-based funding from large districts and states, which means that you have funding, but it's part of it is contingent on outcomes. And the people that are doing good work, I think, are really willing to do that because they believe in their tools.
So Amira has about 14 districts in the United States now where we have outcomes-based contracts. There's a group called the Southern Foundation that's really sponsoring this. They're on their third cohort of districts to do this. It's definitely the right trend. It's getting to what we were talking about before, that there are ways to really introduce measurement into the educational process, and the OBCs are like that. Basically, when we work with a district through an outcomes-based contract, most of our compensation is tied to the definitive movement of test scores and reading ability, and if that doesn't happen, we don't get paid. So it's a great model.
So last question, and I love this question as a parent. The conversation is focused on teacher-student AI trends, or triad, excuse me. Can you talk about the role of parents?
Yeah.
And what is the role in this ecosystem? How can parents play a role, or how can they use AI to engage their children in a good way?
You guys wanna go?
Well, I talked to 200 parents in DC last night, so that's very prescient. So we did DC Council of Parents did a session. We had 700 people sign up and over 200 live last night. And it was great. Oh man, it was our first, like we've done a lot of this work, and this is the first time we've really seen, and I will say we're hearing more and more that parents are an important part of this from districts we work with. But we did like our kind of, it was like an hour like AI literacy piece. We did some prompting, and then we went into some very specific needs to understand. There have been a lot of things in the, like we talk about the iceberg of AI in schools, where the top of the iceberg is AI will be used for cheating. And then there's like 9,000 things below that, and some of them significantly more like actually harmful right now. I don't know if everyone saw, there have been a couple of cases, but a student, a young person, a 14-year-old neurodivergent young man created a relationship on, okay, if you're the parents in here, raise your hands again. Snapchat AI, character AI. You need to be aware of those two things. Snapchat has had an AI since March of last year that's run by ChatGPT. In the UK, 40% of 7 to 12-year-olds had used Snapchat AI last year. And then Character AI is the third most popular chatbot that you've never heard of. After ChatGPT and Gemini, 18 million avatars. Kids as young as 13 can use it without parental permission. It is targeted towards Gen Z. And this young man created an AI girlfriend. Also, if you ever want to have a little bit of a rabbit hole, search AI girlfriend on your app store and see what happens. And he started to have a relationship and started to isolate, and he started talking about suicide. And the bot actually said, you shouldn't do that, but then Sycophantic, it kind of supported it. But the thing is, though, there was no flag at all for self-harm. So that student sent a message, the last thing he ever did was send a message to his AI girlfriend, I'm coming home, and he commits suicide. So when you talk about parents, you talk about this moment in time, and you talk about how fast this is going, this is not the internet, guys. It's not even social media. Think how long social media took for us really to get involved. It took 10 years for Facebook to hit 100 million users. It took 5 weeks for ChatGPT. We have to start recognizing that we have the impact around bias, disinformation, misinformation, deep fakes, and artificial intimacy are so much broader of a need for us to focus on. And the school right now, people are like, AI literacy is their place. To do that for their teachers, their students, and their families is an enormous thing that they have no funding to do and no support to do, which is what we try to help with. But we, like ESSER funding is ran out. But this idea of like having to take a moment and say, we have completely changed the way that we're going to interact with technology in the last 2 years, and it's already happening today. And I think this is where, like, when you talk about parents, like, we have to make, I would love to see more parent-focused startups that are working with parents. I would love to see more work with that, because I'll tell you, last night, super engaged, but the questions we got ran from why are people like banning Grammarly to talking about superintelligence. So they're at all gamuts of don't know anything really, like some of us are, all the way through thinking about it the most. And so there's just that opportunity to bring the community in, but there's no funding. I haven't seen a lot of foundations put money behind this. There's not a lot of like investing into this space. And it can't be something like social media where we just let it go and then we saw what happened. This is going to have a much bigger impact and actually make social media impact larger at the same time. And so I think there's like a real need for us to like bring parents and communities in, but also incentivize the intentional like support of AI literacy across our entire community.
Amen, Amanda. Thank you. Really. This has been an exceptional panel. I would say we've got an issue coming up next week that I hope everybody in this room cares an awful lot about. There is no democracy in the United States without educated citizens. So I want to thank all three of you for trying to get this right. There's a lot of wrong out there, so please keep up the good fight.